To introduce our speaker tonight, I will first want to read a description of his program in a recent arresting essay he's written entitled The Uneasy Relationship Between Democracy and Capital. He writes, when and to what extent does the exercise of private property rights over capital, or even the ability to engage in this exercise, amount to an abridgment of democratic norms? These are the words not of Thomas Piketty, but Thomas Christiano, professor of philosophy and law and co-director of the Center for Law and Philosophy at the University of Arizona. A giant in democratic theory, Professor Christiano has been worrying about capital, inequality, and its relationship to democracy long before the topic was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, before the study from Princeton last week informed us that the United States is no longer a democracy, and even before we learned that the USA is Lesterland. You see, the work of our Thomas, though his shirt is not quite left as unbuttoned as his counterpart, has always been unified by the idea of equal status, which serves as an antipode to hierarchy, subordination, and oligarchy, and which, on his view, can manifest itself in contexts that are not always overtly political. For instance, Christiano argues that owners of capital are subject to democratic norms. For him, the real action is not the lone citizen, as G.A. Cohen suggested in his campaign against Rawls's institutionalism, but the corporation, which has informal duties to cooperate with a government that pursues democratically chosen aims. This view has on-the-ground implications for the minimum wage and other topics in labor law. After all, for Christiano, the market in a liberal democratic society can be thought of as a creation of, in his words, at least the adopted child of a democratic assembly. Christiano brings an unwavering egalitarian conscience to the field. He is author of Rule of the Many and the Constitution of Equality. There he recognizes our diverse interests as citizens, taking seriously our psychological infirmities. He notes our interest in protecting ourselves against cognitive biases, our interest in having a moral personality, and our interest in being at home in the world, a satisfyingly friendly Hegelian thought. Christiano always has done political philosophy from the point of view of those on the receiving end of injustice. His papers include What is Wrongful Exploitation? Must Democracy Be Reasonable? And, as lab members here will be relieved to hear, his essay on money in politics. He serves as editor of Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, and that hasn't stopped him from keeping economists on their toes. In a paper in Ethics, he argues that rational choice theory is, or at least is potentially, self-defeating. Most recently, he's thought about the problems of legitimacy and illegitimacy in international environmental law. We are fortunate tonight to hear him give a lecture entitled Self-Determination and the Human Right to Democracy. Please join me in helping him feel at home in our little world here. Welcome, Professor Christiano.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk here today. I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on the human right to democracy, and the question whether the idea that there is a human right to democracy, if there is, and I argue that there is, whether that's incompatible with the idea of the self-determination of peoples. So it's kind of a puzzle. I mean, it seems like it must be incompatible, because it seems that if you say something like there's a human right to democracy, then what you're doing in effect is demanding that democracy be in place everywhere that it can be in place. And that seems to go against our idea that there may be a right of self-determination of peoples, at least to the extent that we might think that there's a right of self-determination of non-democratic societies. So the paper I'm going to talk about is going to give a brief discussion of the arguments that I have for the idea of a human right to democracy. Those will be relevant in the discussion about self-determination. Then I'm going to say a few things about what I take self-determination of peoples to be and what it means, and how I think one can ground the idea of a right of self-determination. At that point, I'm going to then bring the two discussions together and talk about the possibilities for the possibilities for conflict or the lack thereof. I mean, my conclusion is that there isn't as deep a conflict between the ideas of the right of democracy and the right of self-determination as might have appeared in my initial description of the puzzle. But there is nevertheless some kind of important set of conflicts which I can't say I've completely thought through. There are still some questions in my mind about how to think through these conflicts. But nevertheless, I will end with some open-ended remarks about these conflicts. Now, so just to start, the question is, what do I have in mind by a human right to democracy? What is the notion of a human right to democracy that I have in mind, and how do I argue for this? Well, by a human right here, I'm going to state, as I have on the handout, two sufficient, though not necessary, conditions for a human right to something. There are sufficient conditions and not necessary conditions because, and we can talk about this further in discussion, but my own view is that human rights are actually a pretty diverse set of things, and there may be very different types of conditions for human rights. But I think that this set of conditions that I'm stating, the sufficient conditions, are, as it were, an important set of sufficient conditions which I think makes them, a part of the international system of human rights. So the first condition here of a human right is going to be have a human right to X if there's a strong moral justification for a state to establish, respect, protect, and promote a legal or conventional right to X, or a set of legal and conventional rights to X that can be usefully summarized as a right to X. And two, there's a moral justification for the international community to respect, protect, and promote the above legal or conventional right to X in all persons. So it has these two parts here, and these two parts, this idea of a human right is to a great extent inspired by Charles Beitz's conception of an ideal of, in his book, An Idea of Human Rights, or The Idea of Human Rights, with a couple of differences, as I'll point out. One being that I think it's only a sufficient set of conditions. But second, the other kind of difference is going to be in how I take the strong moral justification to be possible here. So an institution can be strongly morally justified, or when it's normally at least necessary and reliable for realizing some very urgent moral goods. So if we're thinking about like a right to participate as equals in the collective decision-making of society, the idea is going to be to have such a right is strongly morally justified to the extent that it is normally, and that word normally is important here, necessary and reliable in protecting very urgent goods. The reason why I say normally is because I'm thinking of this as stating a relationship of a kind of causation in social affairs, which I think in the case of causation in social affairs is not, as it were, perfectly regimented. So there are outliers, I think, in the case of in the case of social laws. And so here the thought's going to be as normally necessary and reliable. The very urgent moral goods, well, here too I want to take a fairly pluralistic type approach. I mean, one kind of very urgent moral good will be the fundamental interests of persons, say fundamental interests in having the respect of others, or fundamental interests in nourishment, and so on. Another kind of very urgent moral good might be not connected directly with interests, but may be the notion of the protection of human dignity. Or another possibility here, which is going to play a role in this paper, two possibilities here. One would be the protection of some very basic rights, okay, and two, the protection against being treated, morally speaking, as a kind of inferior, or publicly as a kind of inferior within the society that one lives in. So these are all different kinds of urgent moral goods. And again, I mean to be fairly pluralistic about this. So this is one difference in which, from the view of Beitz that I have, which Beitz connects human rights to interests, essentially, whereas I want to say that there may be other kinds of urgent moral goods involved. Now the question then is, so that gives you a sort of a basic picture of the notion of a human right. It's got the idea of a highly justified form of social organization, and then it's got the idea that the moral justification that the international community takes an interest in this. The question then is, to fill out what a human right to democracy is, we want to say something about, well, what is it that we have in mind by democracy? And here, I spell out what I call a conception of minimally egalitarian democracy. And it has, I state, three conditions. Persons have, formally speaking, equal votes, which votes are effective in electing persons into positions of power. Two, persons have equal opportunities to run for office, to participate in the process of deliberation, and so on, where the notion of equal opportunities in this minimally egalitarian sense is going to be something like the absence of physical or material obstacles to participation. It does not require, and this is why it's minimally egalitarian democracy, it doesn't require, say, equal wealth or equal capacity to actually participate, but it requires essentially that there not be violent opposition to one's participation, and that various other features of legal opportunities are present. Three, the society is ruled by the rule of law. The reason why this is important for a human right to democracy is because the way I'm thinking about it is that democracies, what they do is you elect representatives, representatives make laws, and then only, of course, if laws are themselves actually implemented, is it the case that we can say that people have some significant say over the organization of the society that they live in. So those are the three conditions of what I call minimally egalitarian democracy. This concept of a minimally egalitarian democracy is meant to give a kind of expression to what I take to be actually some very important empirical features of democracy. So it's the notion of a minimally egalitarian democracy is not something that I arrive at purely by sort of a priori means, but it's a notion that I arrive at by, as it were, looking at certain empirical facts and noticing that there are certain features of societies that make a big difference in various respects. I'll explain that more as we go along. So the idea then of a human right to democracy is that a legal or conventional right to participate as an equal in the collective decision-making of one's political society is strongly morally justified, and that the international community has a moral justification for, as it were, advancing this right in the various states that are parts of that international community. Now, so that gives you the basic picture of what a human right to democracy is. You can see that the notion of a right that I have in mind here, just another remark on this, is a kind of, is broadly a descendant of a kind of Millian conception of rights, which is a right is something which the society ought to guarantee, a set of interests or goods which are such that the society ought to guarantee their protection. Okay, the reason why I say this is, as I said, I'm a pluralist with regard to human rights. As a matter of fact, I'm also a pluralist with regard to rights more generally. I think that, in fact, there are some rights that are best characterized in this Millian way, which is, as it were, a kind of social organization. There are other rights that may be better characterized in sort of Lockean and Kantian ways, which we might call something like natural rights, where there is a kind of direct reason for protecting the interests or the good of another person that doesn't require this institutional framework. So, again, I think rights of both types exist and are important. Now, so first what I want to do is give very quickly, two arguments for the idea that there is a human right to democracy. And these two arguments are going to be, they're both going to be characterized in two parts, which sort of captures both the strong moral justification element that a state have these rights, and two, the moral justification of the international community. Okay, so the first argument that I give for a human right to democracy is what I would call an instrumental argument. It's an argument from the effects that the possession of such a right has. So what I want to say is democracy is normally necessary and reliable in protecting basic rights of integrity of persons, okay? By which I mean the rights not to be tortured, killed, disappeared, or arbitrarily imprisoned by the state. The rights of physical integrity, or sometimes just called rights of integrity, are rights which are very, very generally recognized in the international system. And they are generally recognized among persons. In that respect, the idea is that the argument that I'm giving is going to be trying to start from a fairly uncontroversial premise, namely the fact of these rights and the importance of these rights in the international system, and then tie democracy with those rights, okay? So the connection being that, again, democracy is normally necessary and reliable in protecting these basic rights of physical integrity. The question is, okay, so what's the evidence for this? It's an instrumental argument, so it's essentially an empirical argument. It's essentially an argument to the effect that, well, if you have democracy, then you're going to protect these rights. And if you don't have it, at least if you don't have the minimally egalitarian democracy, then you're not going to see very good protection of these rights, okay? So there are three types of evidence that I have, or three parts to the idea of the evidence for this empirical thesis. First is there are two types of statistical association between democracy that I call minimally egalitarian democracy and the rights of physical integrity. One of them is a correlation, okay, and it's a really quite striking correlation. And that is what we see in this case, at least a lot of scholars have seen, is that when you think in terms of a right to democracy, when you look at something like here are the violations of rights of physical integrity. And here you think of democracy. What people find is, and here you think, say we have increasing quality of democracy, that in some sense there's some point here and I'm not going to be extremely precise about this right now, but there's some point here which is such that the level of violations of rights of integrity broadly the same, whether you're a democratic society or an authoritarian society. Broadly, the level of rights violations is similar. I mean, this is kind of actually kind of a wavy line, but the idea is that they're broadly similar. There's a point suddenly with a kind of a threshold point where it suddenly goes, the decline in the rights of, the violation of rights of integrity declines very rapidly beyond a certain point. Again, this is a very idealized picture of how this works, but, and the idea here is that what's going on here is what you've gotten at this point is something like what I call minimally egalitarian democracy. Now, the evidence base from this, from these violations of rights of physical integrity, I take from the sort of political terror, or the sources that I have, take it from the assessments from the political terror scale. Here, the evidence base for the types of democracy, well, there are different types of rankings of democracy, of course. The Polity 4 index, which is probably the most widely used ranking. The sort of threshold point at which things change dramatically, something like number 8 on the Polity 4 ranking. But there are other kinds of indexes, the Van Hanen index, and a whole variety of different indexes where you see a very similar type of threshold effect occurring. Now, in addition here, in addition to this correlation, there have been some studies, regression analyses, which have tried to show that this threshold effect occurs in the case of this type of democracy that I'm talking about. When you control for a fair amount of other variables. Now, of course, people aren't able to control for all the other relevant variables that one might think of, but among them are, GDP, which is actually a very important type of variable. Once you control for that, there's still this very strong effect. If you control for population size and some other variables, we find the same kind of threshold effect. It's the idea of a threshold effect here that I'm using to support this thesis that democracy is normally sufficient, or is normally necessary and reliable in protecting these human rights. So once you get beyond the threshold effect, it's pretty reliable, okay? But before you get to there, societies are quite unreliable. And once you move from one kind of society to another, what you should see is a dramatic drop-off within a certain period of time of these kinds of rights of violation of rights of physical integrity. And that's, in fact, what we do see, apparently, according to a number of empirical analyses of democracy, that within a period of 3 or 4 or 5 years, you see societies that become minimally egalitarian, the rights violation begins to drop off dramatically. It's not absolutely immediate. It takes a little while, but it drops off dramatically and it stays quite low after that. Now, I think, I'm not going to say too much about this. I think we also have some kind of a causal model of this, which is that, well, all you need in a democracy is some small amount of concern with other people to make serious violations of human rights on a fairly large scale to be quite unpopular in a democratic society. So the thought is going to be we have some reason for thinking that there's something about democracy that's producing this effect. Okay? So here the thought is going to be something like, here we've got a kind of strong, what I want to say is a strong moral justification to have a legal or conventional right of equal participation on the part of citizens. And the basis of that justification is that there are these very urgent moral goods, namely the protection of these basic rights of physical integrity, that are achieved by this kind of institution, okay? And the thought is that, and here's where this notion of minimally egalitarian democracy seems to be, is kind of empirically important. Namely, what I want to say is this is about the range where we see something like what we call minimally egalitarian democracy. It's a term that's an interpretation of the various measures that Polity 4 and other rankings of democracy use to determine the point at which you get this major change. Okay, but there are two parts to an argument for a human right to democracy. The second part is that there's a reason for the international community, a moral reason for the international community to be concerned with trying to achieve the legal or conventional rights in these societies. And the idea here is that, well, first of all, the international community has a reason to be concerned, morally speaking, with democracy, to the extent that the international community has a reason to pursue the protection of the basic rights of physical integrity. If you think that democracy is necessary and reliable in protecting these, then the thought's going to be, and you think the international system is deeply concerned and rightly concerned with trying to protect these rights, then you have to think that the international system has a moral reason, a strong moral reason, to protect to try to advance the right of democracy. There are two other kinds of considerations that the international system has, and one of them is a consideration generated by the democratic peace, the thesis that democratic states don't go to war with one another, and what I call the sort of democratic compliance argument, which is the thesis that democratic societies tend to comply with international law normally at a significantly higher rate than non-democratic societies. That suggests that the international community has, again, an important moral reason for being concerned with advancing democracy in the international system. So now what I want to say is I give you some argument, a kind of an empirical argument, hence an instrumental argument for the human right to democracy, that's based on the importance of the protection of the rights of physical integrity within each particular society, and is based on the importance of the international community, to the international community of the protection of those rights. So that completes an instrumental argument for the idea that there's a human right to democracy. The second kind of argument I give is a kind of an egalitarian argument. And here, the argument that I have in mind is one that I take from my own work, but I don't think my own work is actually necessary for this. I think there are a lot of different accounts of the justification of democracy that can fit into this particular argument. But I'll just say something sort of from the standpoint of the view of democracy that I defend elsewhere. And that is, the egalitarian argument really has two parts. The first part is that democracy is a kind of public realization of the equality of persons within society. In other words, in the context, if you think about setting up having a political society and attempting to realize through law justice within that political society, and you see that within a political society there's a lot of disagreement on what justice involves in such a society, and there's conflict of interest over what justice is. Furthermore, there's a significant fallibility about what justice consists in, to a great extent because, first of all, we're fallible about understanding what each other's interests are. I'm fallible about understanding my own interests for the most part. I find myself constantly learning new things about what's in my interest, or at least trying to get a better grasp of what's in my own interest. But when it comes to the interests of other persons, particularly the more they become strangers, the more the nature of those interests become difficult to grasp for anyone. So we have a deep fallibility about this. Furthermore, we have a cognitive bias in our ideas about justice. They're biased in the direction of our own interests in various ways. Partly, again, because we understand our own interests and we don't understand the interests of other people as well. Partly because there's just a natural mechanism in us that tends to make us think about justice in a way that is in some ways biased towards our own interests or our own backgrounds and so on. Now, in the light of this kind of disagreement about justice, in the light of the fallibility and the cognitive bias that generates it, and in the light of conflict of interest, what I want to say is when we have disagreement about what justice consists in, there's going to be a fairly unique and distinctive way that we can treat each other as equals. And that is what we do is we give each other an equal say in the process of trying to establish justice in the society that we live in. So the disagreement leads us to accord a certain amount of respect for other people and their judgments. The basic reason for this is the idea that each person has certain fundamental interests in being able to shape the society that they live in accordance with their judgments. Okay? What are those interests? Well, one interest, of course, is in some sense rectifying or correcting, in some sense, the cognitive bias of other people. Okay, so if other people are cognitively biased in favor of their own interests and therefore not against my interests, then the thought's going to be something like, if we can participate as equals, we each have a basic interest in being able to participate in correcting for that cognitive bias. The other interest, which Eric mentioned earlier, is the interest in being at home in the world. In other words, being able to make sense of the world that we live in, being able to, being able to sort of live by the rules of the game in a way that makes sense to us. The idea is we have a fundamental interest in being at home in the world. Furthermore, we have an interest in being treated and being given consideration and recognized as an equal within the society. And if we see somebody has in some deliberate way much more political power than others, we have the sense that we're not being recognized as an equal. Now, so the thought is going to be something like, in the context, again, of disagreement over justice and so on, there's a very distinctive way to realize publicly the equality that each person has with every other person. That's grounded in the interests that people have in shaping the world that they live in a way that is, where they have an interest also in doing so as equals with others. So now the thought's going to be something like, so in a society which is, say, authoritarian or deeply inegalitarian in various ways, the thought is we are being treated publicly, I think, as a kind of inferior, okay? Because the thought is going to be we can see that these interests are set back in favor of the interests of others, and thus, if the system of collective decision-making is set up in that way, then the thought is going to be we're being treated publicly as inferiors. So we have I want to say there's a very urgent moral good that we not be treated publicly as inferiors in the society that we live in. Okay, that's the first part of the argument, where you get an egalitarian reason for there being a strong moral justification for the right to democracy. The second part, the international component, is, of course, also connected with these same kinds of democratic concerns. The thought is that as the system the international system becomes more and more interdependent, and as we see the greater importance of international law in affecting domestic law, either directly or indirectly, what we have, the impulse that gives rise to the concern for democracy at the domestic level also, I think, gives rise to the concern for democracy at the international level. Okay. Now, what I want to say, however, is that at least for now and for probably a couple hundred years from now, the possibility of something like global democracy is really quite beyond the institutional capacity that we have in the modern world. And so I think the way that democratic norms can be realized in the modern world, in the international sphere, is going to be if two conditions, one of which I'm going to emphasize, the other one which I'm not going to talk about very much, but two conditions hold. The first condition is that you've got a system of fair negotiation among societies. This is something which we see actually often quite a distinct absence of in our own society, but I think we can understand the idea of fair negotiation in terms of a kind of democratic norm, namely that these different societies can participate, and the persons in them can participate as equals in the process of shaping the treaties that create international law. The second element is, I think, that in order for a system, an international system that's based on negotiation between states to satisfy democratic norms, I think it's got to be the case that those states have to be democratic as well. So the thought is going to be something like persons participate as equals in a process whereby states then negotiate with each other, the thought being that we have some standard of fairness for evaluating that process of negotiation. But in order for the system of international negotiation to, as it were, treat persons as equals, it's got to be that they can participate as equals in the societies that are doing the negotiating with each other. Okay, so now the thought's going to be, well, we have a reason, I think, for the international community to be concerned with democracy at the domestic level, because it's a condition of the realization of the democratic norms at the international level. Okay, so now we have, I've given two arguments. One is an instrumental argument in terms relating to the rights of physical integrity and the protection of those rights of physical integrity, and then a more egalitarian argument relating to the idea that domestic democracy is, in some sense, a condition for the realization of democracy or some democratically legitimate decision-making at the international level. Okay, those are the two arguments that I give for the human right to democracy. Now the question is going to be, okay, what about collective self-determination? Here, again, the thought is going to be people have thought there's a conflict between these two, and some people like Charles Bates and Joshua Cohen, for example, have argued that because there's a conflict between these two, we ought not to have a human right to democracy. Okay, so they argue against the idea that there should be a human right to democracy on the basis of the thought that there's a conflict between these two things. I'm going to counteract that. And so let me say first what I think the idea of collective self-determination involves before I talk about the right of collective self-determination. And the basic idea here is that a society is collectively self-determining to the extent that its members see it as organized politically in accord with basic political norms that they genuinely accept. Okay? Now here's the thought, though, and I'm going to try to defend this further as we go on. I'm going to want to say that, well, in the absence of agreement on basic political norms, there's a kind of default condition for collective self-determination, which is that the society be democratic. Okay, I'm going to try to defend that in what follows here. The idea of genuine acceptance is a tricky notion, and I'm just going to make a few remarks. We can talk about it more in discussion. But the idea is that if the basic norms of the political society are approved of by a person on the basis of some kind of reasoned reflection, including reflection on alternatives, and not on the basis of fear of reprisals or ignorance or so forth, then one can say that a person genuinely accepts the basic norms of the society. Now that, I don't mean to say, of course, that the reasoned reflection produces a correct outcome, just that there's some sort of standard of reasoned reflection. And you could imagine people arriving at different conclusions from this kind of reasoned reflection. Now, and as you can see, I mean, that's going to open up the possibility of there being non-democratic self-determination. All right. Now, let me just say the rights of collective self-determination. In fact, I think that there are really two. But we might also characterize the situation as there being a kind of a strong conception of self-determination and a weaker conception of self-determination. And that'll become relevant later on. But the two rights I have in mind is a right against military interference and highly coercive sanctions. So a society has a right to self-determination when it has a right against this military interference or highly coercive sanctions. But the second, it's actually a cluster of rights. A second type of right is a right to participate as equals in the international community. So to participate in treaty making, to participate in international trade, to participate in the international financial system, to be the potential recipient of non-essential assistance, financial or otherwise, by the international system. The idea here being that it's a kind of right of inclusion in the international system. So to say that a society is collectively self-determining, or has a right to collective self-determination, is to say that it has a right not to be interfered with militarily or through these coercive sanctions, but also a right to be included in the international system and its various activities. Now, the collective right of self-determination then is going to be grounded in a strong moral justification for the international community to accord these rights of non-interference and inclusion to a society. All right. What are the grounds of this right of of collective self-determination? What are the grounds? Well, here, and this is very important for the way the whole argument sort of works out, is that basically I take the grounds to be very similar to the grounds for the right to democracy. Namely, what the grounds are going to be that you have an interest in being able to shape the social world that you live in accordance with your judgment. And then in relation to other societies, you have an interest in being able to do this as an equal. That is, at least without the interference of other societies, and where other societies are willing to include you in international activities when you do this. So the thought's going to be, just like with the right to democracy, there are these fundamental interests that lead, that ground the right to democracy. Here is the right of self-determination. There are very similar rights, very similar interests that ground the right of self-determination. Okay. Now, here it's important to specify a kind of qualification to the right of collective self-determination that becomes important here. I've said there are interests in being able to shape the social world in accordance with your judgment. But what I want to say is that those interests are significantly weakened, or have a weaker status, to the extent that the interests are connected with advancing injustice. Okay? The thought is, the reason why this is important is because the thought's going to be something like, I've made some arguments for the human right to democracy, which are basically justice right-based arguments, either an instrumental connection to basic rights of physical integrity, or a connection to the idea of treating persons publicly as equals, which I take also to be a notion of justice. The thought's going to be something like, if you have an interest in collective self-determination, and you realize that interest by forming a non-democratic society, if it's the case that one agrees that democracy is, as it were, a standard of justice, and both Beitz and Cohen would agree with that, as would Rawls, for example, would be another opponent in this area, then it's going to be the case that the interest that you have in advancing a non-democratic form of government, that is, in advancing a system where some people are treated publicly as inferiors, is, I think, a kind of diminished interest. Okay? It doesn't dissipate altogether, and we can talk about this more in discussion. It doesn't dissipate altogether, but it is a diminished interest, because it's an interest that is, in some sense, in injustice. Okay? Now that's going to be, that's going to lead to a kind of qualification to the collective right, to the right of collective self-determination of non-democratic societies. Okay, as we'll see in just a minute. Okay, so I make a comparison. I'm not going to draw the comparison now since I don't want to run out of time. Now I want to say something about what I take to be the nature of the right of self-determination. Okay? Here's the basic thesis. The right of collective self-determination is actually based on the human right to democracy. Okay? It's based on the human right to democracy. I'm going to try to defend this as we go on, but the thought is it's based on the human right to democracy, and we'll see how here. How is it based in this way? This is what I'm thinking. The human right to democracy comes attached with a moral power to waive the right to democracy. Okay? You have a right, and you can waive it. And there are some rights, I think, which we think are waivable by people. Okay? There are some rights that we think are waivable by people. I don't think all rights are waivable, but there are some rights that are waivable. And it makes particular sense to think that the human right to democracy could be waivable. Okay? It makes particular sense because the ground of the human right to democracy is in the fundamental interests to shape the social world one lives in accordance with one's judgment. Okay? So now the thought's going to be, well, if one's judgment now is that democracy is not what one wants, actually maybe democracy is the wrong thing, okay, then it looks like one of the considerations that led us to the idea that there's a human right to democracy is also leading us to think that, well, strictly speaking, someone could waive that right to democracy. But there's a complication here. The waiving of rights, like, if I promise to do something for you, And, you know, and then the day when I'm supposed to do it, you say, oh, don't worry about it. You don't have to do it after all. That's a waiving of your right in that case. In general, what I want to say is that the waiving of rights is waiving that can only be done in a self-regarding way. I can't waive somebody else's rights. I can only waive my own rights. Okay? So I can't waive someone else's right to democracy, but I can waive my own right to democracy. Okay? But the problem is the following. And this is moving us towards the idea that a democracy has this primacy. The problem is that the rights of democracy, and the rights of democracy are not unique in this respect, but they are probably the most salient case, are interdependent. My rights are interdependent with yours, okay? Let me give you an example of that, at least as I see it as an example. Suppose I sell my right to Eric, and now Eric has two rights, and you have one. In some sense, what's going on is, by selling my right to Eric, I have, in some sense, created an inequality between you and the other person. And thus, by selling my right, by waiving my right, through transfer in this case, in effect what I've done is I've undermined political equality, which means I've undermined your right to participate as an equal in the collective decision-making. Okay? That's one of the striking features of democratic rights, is their interdependence. Namely, if I try just on my own, by transfer, to waive my rights, I actually undermine other people's rights in this context. And I think the prohibition on vote selling is probably the easiest kind of case, but there are other kinds of possible cases that can hold. But now the thought's going to be the following. If a person, the only way a person can waive his or her right to democracy is if they waive it with everybody else, or, well, nearly everyone else. Okay? So now you can imagine a society saying, you know, like Grotius imagines, they give away their right to a king. Okay? They transfer it all. And the thought is going to be, that's really the condition under which waiver is possible in the case of waiving the right of democracy. This is going to raise some perplexity. So I have some uncertainty about the implications of this claim, so I'm going to want to talk about this as we go along, in discussion. But okay, now you might say, well, why though is the default position democracy? Okay, and the sort of the non-democratic collective self-determination, why is that something that has to be achieved through this arduous process of getting near unanimity? Okay, and my thought is going to be, well, the reason why is because of the initial arguments in favor of the justice or of the basic right to democracy. Okay, so the thought is going to be, it's just. Of course, a group of people can waive those rights and then, in some sense, waive the right to democracy, but they don't. But it's not unless they waive them collectively that they can actually give up the right to democracy. All right. Now, let me just say two. There's going to be a perplexity about this notion of waiver, because of course in most contexts where we think of even the most idealized examples of non-democratic, collectively self-determining societies, we're not thinking these people have sort of, as it were, actively waived their right. Okay, that hasn't actually happened in some in terms of as a kind of action. But what I want to say is, what you can think of in those contexts is that there's a kind of analog to waiving an analog which you could see, for example, in the following example with the promissory right. If I promise you to paint your house on a certain day at a certain time, and the day comes and the time comes and I go to your house and I'm about to paint your house, but I see it's obvious that you have totally different plans now for this house. You want to now make it a red brick house or something. I don't know how. But you're not around to ask, okay? And it's clear that my painting it would be incompatible with those plans. Now, I'd want to say that you've done something that's analogous to waiving your right to my painting that house, okay? Even though you may not have actually done anything, it's just that now your plans are, in some sense, incompatible with what you had a right that I do for you, okay? So I want to say that the case of collective self-determination of non-democratic societies is going to be a kind of waiver in that sense. Another detail, which we can talk about more, is that I don't think that these waivers can be waivers in perpetuity. So you don't waive the right and then it's lost forever and you can't get it back. It's something that can be reclaimed, but that's okay. So let's talk a little bit about the potential for conflict between the right to democracy. Well, first let me just say how there's a compatibility, right? I've just given you a picture of the right of collective self-determination and the right of democracy, which make them compatible, essentially, okay? There's not a deep incompatibility, and the reason why is because I basically undermined one of the things that seem to produce the puzzle, which is if you have a right to democracy, then there's got to be always a demand for democracy. What I'm saying is, well, if the right to democracy comes with a power to waive it, there are going to be some contexts in which that demand is no longer there, okay? And that's how you get the compatibility in a fairly deep conceptual sense between collective self-determination of non-democratic societies with the human right to democracy. You can see also why the thesis that I started with, which is, well, the right of collective self-determination is grounded in the human right to democracy, how that's supposed to work now. The thought is going to be, well, basically democratic societies are self-determining, but where you've got a group with, you've got near unanimous agreement on waiving that right, then you can have a society that's collectively self-determining and has a right to collective self-determination even though it's non-democratic. All right. But now let me talk about the conflicts between this human right to democracy and this self-determination of non-democratic societies. The basic conflict comes from the fact that we live in a world where societies, and we could talk more about this, but I take societies to be, in some sense, required to participate in cooperation with other societies in the international sphere, in the making of international law. The basic, I'll just give you some examples, what I take to be mandatory. I think there are mandatory moral aims. And that is, for example, the requirement that societies try to avoid global environmental catastrophe, I think, is a morally mandatory aim. And societies are required to try to find some way of cooperating with each other so as to avert this kind of disaster. I think there's also a morally mandatory aim in the need to reduce as much as possible severe global poverty, or to maintain international peace and security. These are also morally mandatory aims that are going to require cooperation among societies. So we live in a situation where you've got independent states, but where the states are required to enter into cooperative relations with each other. Okay, and which means in this context, they're required to create, by means of treaty, essentially, international institutions that help solve some of these problems. Okay. Now, but this introduces a problem. negotiation between democratic and non-democratic states produces two difficulties in particular. One I call the problem of complicity, and the other one I call the problem of subordination. In the case of complicity, what I have in mind here is if you have a democratic society and a non-democratic society, I'm going to take a really idealized case of this just to make it easy for me, at least. In democratic and non-democratic societies, you've got which is ruled essentially by a dictator, and suppose they're the same population and same level of wealth. The thought is that you're now creating law, okay, which is then going to either directly or indirectly regulate each society, okay? So they're involved in the activity of creating law that's going to regulate the non-democratic society. What's going on is then the democratic citizens of the democratic society are, I think, in part complicit in treating the members of the non-democratic society as less than equal, okay? They're colluding in some sense with the sort of authoritarian elite in the other society to impose law on people generally that they're not participating in creating. Okay. Now you might say, but wait a minute, but the assumption in the background is collective self-determination. So these people have actually given their right away to this monarch, or again, I'm making it simple because but my thought is going to be, yeah, but as democratic citizens, we think that they've given their rights away mistakenly. And the question is, we might allow them to treat each other that way if they all agree with that. But there's a problem for us to participate in that inequality to the extent that we don't actually think people are unequal, okay, in the democratic society. So there's some degree to which the members of the democratic society are complicit in the non-democratic features of a collectively self-determining society that's non-democratic. Okay, that's the first problem of complicity. Second problem is, in some senses, this is going to be a fundamental problem once we take the idea of the waiver, or self-regarding waiver, seriously. The thought is here, just again, the idealized example. You've got a democratic society and you've got a society ruled by an authoritarian elite, okay? Same size, same wealth, roughly speaking, and so on. They are negotiating with each other to impose law on both societies, okay? So there's law imposed on the democratic society. Now, here's the thought. The authoritarian elite in the non-democratic society has more power over the creation of the relevant laws in this democratic society than the citizens within the society. Okay? Because they just negotiate with the whole collective. Okay? And so, in some sense, the authoritarian elite has more power than each democratic citizen. Maybe not than the collective of the democratic citizen, but each democratic citizen. Okay? Which means there's a difficulty here, which is that it means that in this context of required cooperation, the waiver of democratic rights within this collectively self-determining society has affected the democratic rights of the citizens of the democratic society who haven't waived their rights. They're now, as it were, not participating as equals in the creation of law that's imposed on the democratic society. And so as a consequence, there's a puzzle here because the puzzle looks like once we start thinking of the international system in terms of these required forms of cooperation, okay, then it looks like self-determining non-democratic societies are in some sense partially waiving, the citizens in that self-determining non-democratic society are partially waiving the democratic rights of people in the democratic society. So the minute you get this morally mandatory cooperation, you've got a problem, given the self-regarding waiver requirement, okay? This is it's a puzzle here because, you know, it looks like this squeezes out the possibility of collective self-determination of non-democratic societies, okay, because it conflicts in some sense with democracy within the democratic societies. Now you wonder, okay, you know, how much room is there for this? Now there is a kind of theoretical solution to this, which is not a highly likely empirical solution, which is to say, well, you know, when it comes to the making of international law, the members of the non-democratic society can participate as equals, but not when it comes to the making of domestic law. As I said, it's a theoretical solution. At least it suggests how there's a kind of logical compatibility still here between the right of democracy and collectively self-determining non-democratic societies. Another puzzle, of course, comes to the very first argument that I started with the human right to democracy, which is that if non-democratic societies are highly prone to violating basic rights of physical integrity, it's normally guaranteed that you're going to have a big increase in the violation of rights of physical integrity. Then the question is, well, what are we supposed to think about these collectively self-determining non-democratic societies? There are two possibilities here. One, you could say, well, maybe they can waive their rights of physical integrity, right? That's a possibility. The other possibility is, well, we just restrict it to societies that the very rare cases that don't violate physical integrity and that are non-democratic. Again, it seems to be squeezing the possibility of collective self-determination out of the picture slowly but surely. The idea of waiving a right of physical integrity, I just want to make a very brief comment about this, and then I'm going to close it up with a sentence or two. I think it makes sense to say that somebody can waive their right to democracy because, after all, democracy is about being able to choose the world you live in, and so you should be able to choose, at least at the limit, you should be able to choose against democracy. But the rights of physical integrity are not about choice in this way. The right not to be tortured, the right not to be murdered, they're not about choice primarily. They're about fundamental interests that people have in the avoidance of extreme pain and, you know, sort of well, I won't go in further detail about torture, but extreme pain on the one hand or death on the other hand. It's not about choice. So it's not obvious that you would have a power to waive the right of physical integrity. Maybe there is, but I'm not sure I see it. Okay, so there too we see another limit. So what I've said so far is we got this human right to democracy, and I think there are rights of collective self-determination. And even at the limit, non-democratic societies can have a collective right of self-determination. But what I want to say is that certainly in the modern world, them possessing a collective right of self-determination is in some sense in conflict with the democratic rights of citizens in democratic societies, and it may be in conflict with the rights of physical integrity of their own citizens. So with those two things, it looks like there's not going to be that much room here for collective self-determination of non-democratic societies. Let me just, one last qualification here just to finish it up, and that is that I said that there were two rights here, one of non-interference and one of inclusion. I think the right of inclusion is particularly called into question by the human right to democracy. But it might still be that even if we think that these non-democratic societies don't have full rights of collective self-determination, they may still have rights not to be militarily interfered with for reasons that we can go into in more detail. But the thought is going to be to reject the collective self-determination idea, the right of collective self-determination for non-democratic society, is not to entail that the thought that, well, now there's suddenly a permission to militarily interfere with non-democratic societies. In fact, I think generally there is no such permission for reasons we can go into in more detail. But anyway, that's my thesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'll be fielding questions. I'm demonstrating the classroom technology now by holding down the button continuously. Start getting the cue going.
Thank you for the talk. I had two brief questions. Maybe they're mainly concerned with my lack of sufficient understanding of your notion of democracy, so you can clarify this. One thing is, I wonder, why do you say that when one is unable to shape the world in accordance with one's judgment, they're treated as inferior? I mean, obviously, this happens all the time, that we disagree and you try to change. You know, you just try to convince me that if I thought with Cohen that these two rights are incompatible, that I was wrong. And I mean, obviously, you didn't treat me as inferior. So that's just one, obviously, clarificatory point. The other question is, what about making sure that we respect the interest that people have to live in a world that is shaped according to their judgment by shaping their judgment? That is, we can just make sure that they judge that they should live in an authoritarian regime, and then the world is shaped according to their judgment. And so it's not clear to me that the point you make about the self-regarding waiver restriction is necessarily leads to the kind of restriction that you want, because I can say, well, I don't need democracy, and I'll just make sure that they reach the same conclusion by having a sufficiently effective authoritarian regime.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, at the limit, that should be possible. I don't, you know, in other words, if you manage to persuade everybody in the world to waive their rights to democracy, then it would not be a violation of their human right to democracy if you now had all non-democratic societies, because they've had a right which they waived. The waiver is part of the right. About your first question, I take persuasion to be, and maybe this is connected with your second question, but I take persuasion as not a case of treating another person as an inferior. What I take to be treating another person as an inferior is if I decide for you how you're going to live, and you don't get a say in that, okay? That's where I think there's a kind of treating another person as an inferior. Now, in a democratic society, you know, to some degree, majorities make this decision for the whole society, right? But the thought is going to be something like, in a well-functioning democratic society where you've got the sort of circulation of majorities, you don't actually have a particular group that's telling another group how it should be, you know, how it should live. You've just got a process of collective decision-making where you have different majorities at different times deciding different things. So I want to say that that's not a case of treating a person as an inferior. But persuasion in particular, I mean, if it's persuasion that's not done by browbeating or, you know, I don't know, intimidation or manipulation, that is not a case, I think, of treating a person as an inferior. That's a case of respecting a person's judgment, because now they decide for themselves what they think the right answer is.
And you think this is the way politics is usually?
What?
No. I'm just saying that manipulation and browbeating and intimidation is it's a part of democratic discourse to a great degree.
Yeah. But I take them to be illegitimate parts. So those are defects in a democratic process. Of course, we do see it a fair amount, but whenever we see it, we think, yeah, there's something defective about this process. So it's in some sense violating democratic norms.
Yes.
I have an observation, a complaint, and then a question. Sorry, I have an observation, a complaint, and a question. The observation is you started off by giving us a rather, what you called it, the minimal egalitarian version of democracy, and the word minimal resonated there, but as you were fleshing it out and giving us more substance, it actually sounds like a very substantive and very demanding ideal, in particular once you started talking about things, people having a basic interest in shaping society in accordance with their judgment. They must have that judgment and information and all that, right? And then, most interestingly, then in that context, you even mentioned an interest in being involved in processes in shaping international law, right? And that's curious, because if you think of Robert Dahl's classic discussion of that point, that's exactly where he gets cold feet when he says, if we are taking democracy very seriously, that would mean they would be getting involved in processes shaping international law, and that would just be weird, right? So the observation is you are starting off with what sounds like something very minimal, but you are enriching it ever more, and it's actually a very, very rich ideal in the end.
Yeah.
That leads me to the complaint. So the complaint is when you talk about self-determination, in a way you're introducing the grounding it makes it sound like the democracy and self-determination are actually closer together than really they are. So I think what grounds an interest in self-determination is a collective will to live in accordance with norms that are authentically endorsed, right? But it's about the authentically endorsing, not the activity of being involved in the shaping, right? And so, that's the endorsing, right? And that is perfectly compatible with saying, we don't think that people around here in this part of the country, people like us, should be actively involved with government. That doesn't actually mean we think we are publicly treated as inferiors. We are just not publicly treated as people who should be ruling, right? So the grounding comes in any event from the authentic endorsement, not from the shaping. And that now gives me my question, namely, so if you actually, think of an example, right? I mean, I'm not even going to mention one, but just kind of whatever example you like, right, of a society where we have something like this, where we have an endorsement of norms that are not democratic, and then you come with your highly, this, I think, very idealized scenario of democracy. What bite could that possibly have when they say, and you would, you would be moved to agree, impartial observers would be moved to agree, yes, they do authentically endorse non-democratic governance. What bite on that could possibly your appeal to ideal democracy have on that would move them to change anything?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Good. So let's think about this. So the notion of minimally egalitarian democracy is meant to fall very short of a fully just society, or even a fully just democracy. Because even the notion of a minimally egalitarian democracy is a society where, first of all, probably differences in wealth can play a significant role in determining outcomes. I mean, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty about it, but it's going to the notion of equality of opportunity that I've stated as the second part is meant to be a fairly formal notion of equality of opportunity. It's that people aren't, as it were, threatened or legally excluded from forming different political parties and so on, or associations, or running for office, et cetera. But there may be, various ways in which the system is biased in favor of some group or another that is compatible with that kind of equality of opportunity. So this notion of a minimally egalitarian democracy is meant to be fairly minimal, and it certainly falls short of an ideal of democracy that I think holds. Now, but you asked the question, which I think is a good question, because the egalitarian argument that I give, where I invoke the interests and so on, is actually is sort of part of the egalitarian argument that I give for the sort of ideal of democracy that I defend in, like, the Constitution of Equality. But I guess what I want to say is that the minimally egalitarian democracy, while very far from the ideal of democracy, as our society, for example, is, and most democratic societies are, is nevertheless an important concept. And it's an important concept because it looks like when people have these kinds of rights, it makes a big difference to the moral character of the society. Even though it's not fully ideal, it makes a difference. Okay, and that's where the empirical claim comes. It's a concept that is, in some sense, given determinacy by the empirical situation. And so what I want to say is that even the second egalitarian argument is going to say something like, well, this is still, it's a kind of equality that is, of course, less than the ideal form of equality in terms of political equality. But it's a kind of equality where people are, in some important way, genuinely effective in playing a role in their society. And one way you can see it is through the instrumental argument, because they actually have they play some role in diminishing very important human rights violations. So I do think that I'm trying to make this a notion that's fairly minimal, but I see the worry, the tension is, well, why isn't it a stronger notion? But actually, I think the minimal notion works because of the empirical effects that the realization of this minimal notion actually has on the world that people live in. Now, with the complaint, I guess I think that maybe I didn't understand the objection, but I guess I think that the right of collective self-determination doesn't just involve let's see. It doesn't merely involve that the basic norms of the society are in accordance with one's judgment. But maybe this does need to be more fleshed out. What I want to say is that that's part of the explanation for why the basic norms are what they are. So it's not merely that I have this state of endorsement. It's that, in some sense, the reason why the society has this character is because we endorse it, particularly in the case of the collectively self-determining, non-democratic society. So in that respect, it is closer, I think, to the democratic idea, which is that the democratic idea wants to give people a say in how to structure their society. And this, in some sense, at least for the special case where you've got near unanimity, gives people a say in how to structure their society, in effect. Because in some sense, the way it's structured is partly explained by the reasoned, genuine acceptance. That's the idea. Does that help?
Well, you'd be building most of the answer to your challenge into the setup then, right? If that's what you do, right?
Well, what do you mean? The idea is going to be that the collective self-determination, I mean, this is part of the idea of determination, right? This is why the society is this way, or at least it's part of the explanation why the society is this way, is that people think that this is the way it ought to be.
Ming.
Oh, I wanted to ask about your argument or your criticism that people could exercise the right of self-determination to reject democracy, to waive their right to democracy.
Right.
I was wondering if your argument might be strengthened in two ways. One is to claim that people might be able to waive their right to democracy for themselves, but they can't bind people in future generations. So you might be able to bind your right to democracy, but it doesn't seem like you could waive the right of your children or grandchildren.
Yeah.
And the second question is how the waiving of the right to democracy could take place if democracy isn't in place in the first place. So what Bites and Rawls are trying to do is to defend currently authoritarian societies that never have had democracy. But it seems that in order to waive the right of democracy, you need to have open public debate and an equal voice for people.
Yeah.
But that assumes that there's some stage of democracy that people have to pass through before the waiving of democracy could take place.
Good. Yeah, I like the question about future generations. I mean, I agree that they can't bind future generations, but I do think that a current non-democratic generation can, as it were, transfer the non-democratic form of organization to its children. So they then may grow up in the context of a non-democratic society. I think that is part of the right of self-determination. Now, the children can then say, no, we reject this, and then try to turn it around. But I don't think there's I don't think that the parents are disabled from preserving the non-democratic form of organization when their children and the subsequent generations come in. Although the children can say no to it. I think actually, in general, people, I mean, I don't think that the waiver is a waiver in perpetuity, so you can take it back in some sense. But I'd be curious to see what you think about that. But the second point that you made, I'm sorry, could you remind me of that second point?
Oh, the second point is that for a waiver to be exercised, it seems like there has to be democracy in the first place, so that people are able to debate it and vote on it. So how could you?
Good. I want to say that that's not true, but I agree that this is not an obvious point. This is why I start by saying what collective self-determination is, which is a collectively self-determining society is a society in which people genuinely accept the norms under which they live, and that's part of what explains what it is. Okay. It doesn't have to be that they were at a previous type of society and now they chose the new kind. It's that this is the importance of genuine acceptance and the explanation condition. Now it's true that if they change their mind about this genuine acceptance, then they can change to a democratic society. Or even if a minority changes its mind. This is one of the hard points of this argument, I think. If a minority changes its mind, a significant minority, then this whole society has to revert to democratic society, because otherwise the others are waving for them. But I don't think it doesn't have to start with a democracy and then turn into it. So the example that I had in the case of the promissory right, where I promise you something and then you just forget about it and you start other plans and you you're really excited about your new plans, and mine would be incompatible with it, but you're not around, and I can just tell that it's compatible. I can think that you've waived the right because it looks like you just have different plans for what you want. It doesn't require that I've done something and that you've, all that's required here is that you have the right and that you waive it. Not that you actually have a democratic, you have the thing to which you have a right and then you give it away. It's just that you waive the right itself. Does that help?
I guess my question is how we can tell whether people really do consent to an authoritarian government. Good.
That's a very good question. It's not a question I've tried to answer here, because in that sense, this paper certainly falls short of sort of strictly institutional recommendations. What I'm trying to get at here is an intuition, and I think that the Rawls, Cohen, Bites, all this. An intuition which I think that they're onto, there's something right about it, that there can be this collective self-determination of non-democratic societies. And I get at it by this notion of genuine acceptance. But how then you would construct an institutional arrangement that could make sure that people actually did genuinely accept in this context? I'm not really sure. I mean, I suppose that's what maybe constitutional conventions are sometimes about, or things like that. I think sometimes we have a sense that a group of people genuinely accepts the basic norms under which they live, and that's why they accept it. But yeah, I haven't said how we can determine whether or not how we can know that in fact they genuinely accept it. No, that's good.
Well, it's time to thank Thomas for his lecture tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.